Hi everybody, Professor Faylauer here. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about language availability. When we look at language availability, we really are looking in a very analytical way at how, to what level language is accessible to the user, to the speaker. So language might be very readily available and accessible. Language may be available but difficult to access, or language may not be available at all. So to talk about language availability, I'm going to be resourcing Daniel Gile's work. Daniel Gile created two models that are helpful for our understanding of language availability and why it matters for those who are interpreters or emerging interpreters. So the first model I want to talk about that Daniel Gile developed is called the efforts model. The efforts model. And in this model, Dr. Gile, who is a spoken language translation scholar, he identified 4 efforts involved in the interpreting process. These 4 efforts are the listening effort. The listening effort would include the analysis and comprehension of a message. So as we know, in order to interpret, we have to be able to comprehend. But more than just comprehending the surface level of the message that's being conveyed, we have to be able to analyze. We have to be able to see implied meaning as well as obvious meaning. So the analysis and comprehension, and this requires effort. Now, the second effort Daniel Gile identified was the memory effort, which has to do with our short-term memory and our working memory, how we're accessing memory to engage in the interpreting process. The third effort that he identified was the production effort. The production effort would be the effort that we put toward producing the message, whether verbally or manually for American Sign Language. And that requires efforts to formulate a message, to put it together in proper sequence and order, to represent it clearly and articulately. And so that would be the production effort. And then the fourth effort is kind of an umbrella, kind of covering effort of all the other 3, which is called the coordination effort. Coordination effort would be the effort that we put into coordinating all of the, engaging in all of the other efforts, the listening, the memory, and the production. It actually takes a separate effort to coordinate and balance our efforts between the other 3. So that's a really quick treatment of Daniel Gile's efforts model. Now, what does this matter to us, or why is this important for interpreting? Well, as we're interpreting, we are applying our effort in a variety of ways related to the interpreting process. So, in those 4 categories that Daniel Gile identified in his model of the efforts model. Now, language availability is an important feature for at least 2 of the efforts of Daniel Gile's listed efforts. One would be the listening effort, the other would be the production effort. Language availability is important because the more effort that we have to expend to either comprehend, to understand the language, or to be able to quickly and efficiently produce the language, then the less effort we have for the other categories of effort, if that makes sense. So we're limited beings. We can't have 100% effort in all 4 categories. Effort is actually balanced among the different categories of effort. So language availability, if it is very high in a given circumstance, given situation, if we're able to readily comprehend the language, to produce the language, then we are able to presumably apply less effort in that particular domain, leaving us with more effort to apply in other domains. Also leaving the interpreting process overall, hopefully, a little bit less exhausting. So another model that Daniel Gile developed that I'll talk about here to help us understand language availability is called the gravitational model of language availability. Now the gravitational model, I'm going to draw a picture that will be helpful. You can also find this picture online if you just Google search Daniel Gile gravitational model. You can find an image there. But essentially a target, okay? So like Target, the store, the retail store, just think Target store, Daniel Gile gravitational model. Put those together, maybe it'll help you remember. Okay, so in the middle of the target, this is the language that would be very readily available, very accessible. Language units that are further out toward the edge of the target would be language that's available but very difficult to retrieve. Then language units that live all out here outside of the model. These are all the things that we have never been exposed to, never seen, never heard, or completely forgotten if we have seen or heard them. And those are not available or accessible at all. So with this model, there's a range of a zone here near the center that would be called your active zone. And then you have a range of a zone here on the outside of the model, of the target, that would be called your passive zone. So language that's in your active zone, relatively easy to access. Again, language that's in your passive zone would be relatively, well, it's accessible, but it requires more effort. Now, one way to think about it is like this. If you were sitting at a desk and you needed to reference a book, you needed to find a page number or a quote from a book. Now, if you had the book already sitting on your desk, it was right there, you were already familiar with what chapter that particular quote was in, and it was just an arm's length away. Then you can just reach over, pick it up, open the book, find the chapter, find the quote. A little bit of effort required there, but not a lot of effort. Now, contrastly, if the book was in your library, which happened to be in the other room, or on a different floor of your house, and you had to walk into your library, look at the shelves, try to find it on the shelf, pull it out, then find the chapter, then find the quote. A considerable more amount of effort is required there. So both accessible, but different levels of effort. So pretty clear kind of understanding there on the variations of effort. So that's kind of how language works, is the more readily available language is, the easier it is to access, the less effort. So there are 5 rules that Daniel Gile developed that relate to the gravitational model of language. I'm going to present those to you. Hopefully it'll help you understand a little bit more how this works. So the first rule is the centrifugal principle. So C-E-N-T-R-I-F-U-G-A-L, centrifugal principle. Now this is the idea that if language that we do have, that we know, if it's not stimulated, meaning it's not used, it's not accessed for a length of time, or if it's not accessed regularly, those language units will tend to drift out here toward the edge and be harder to access, require more effort. It's also possible for them to leave the target altogether and not be accessible at all, depending on how long it's been. So that's the centrifugal principle of language, and it's true for language. If you don't use it, you lose it. That's that idea. Rule number 2 is the centripetal effect, which is C-E-N-T-R-I-P-E-T-A-L, centripetal effect. This is the converse of rule 1. So the more language is stimulated, used, accessed, the closer it gets to the middle of the target, the more accessible it is, the less effort it takes to access it. And then when we look at rule 3, this has to do with frequency of stimulation. So the frequency of stimulation of language, how often we access that language, how often we view it, hear it, write it, speak it, the more frequent, the more accessible. And the less frequent, the less accessible. So that language accessibility ties directly to frequency. So that was Daniel Gile's rule 3. Rule number 4 is the difference between active and passive stimulation. That the centripetal, which is the movement toward the center of the target, requires or will be impacted differently, whether the stimulation of language is active or passive. So active stimulation would be things like hearing a term, seeing a term, or a sentence or a phrase, an idiom, and then not only hearing it or seeing it, but understanding how it was used in context, maybe grabbing a dictionary, looking it up in the dictionary, writing the definition, writing the word or series of words, dialoguing with a friend or colleague about that word or series of words. All of these things are active ways of learning. We're engaging with the language and with the content. Using that in a variety of contexts ourselves. Once we take it on, once it's in our registry, then we use it. This is active stimulation of language. Passive stimulation of language would just be being exposed to it, so seeing it or hearing it, okay, understanding it mostly, at least in that context of how it was used, but not playing with it in other contexts, not really looking it up to find an exact definition. That would be a passive engagement with language. So the centripetal effect, movement of language toward the center and it being more accessible, is directly tied to whether the stimulation is, first of all, there at all, and if it's active or passive. And then the fifth and final rule of the Daniel-Gile's gravitational model is the escort principle, as well as the interference effect. So the escort principle says that if you have a language unit that's maybe further on the outside of your graph, or maybe outside completely, but you learn of that, you bring it here. Well, as that language is stimulated and it moves closer to the center, there are other language units that you may have been familiarized with around that language unit. So it might be other words contained in the definition, or it might be that term or terms used in context, and then the surrounding definers of that context then also become known and become familiar. And so those can actually move together as a group toward the center, which is pretty cool. And then the opposite is also true, which would be the interference effect. So when language is interfered with, blocked, lost, not stimulated, that as it moves outward to become less available or less accessible, that there are other language units that may also move out with it. So this would be the escort effect, and the fact that language can be interfered with and can be lost. So these are the 5 rules of the gravitational model. Now, what's the point of all of this? Well, as we're processing, or as we're going through the interpreting process, as we're working, as our brain is thinking, as we're receiving a message, analyzing it for meaning, reformulating in our brain, producing the message back, it requires a lot of effort. And the more we can have more language that's available to us in both English and ASL, the less effort we expend in that area. Now, that's a benefit for us as interpreters. So, we can do a lot of practical things to increase our language availability by using both ASL and English in a variety of contexts, a variety of ways, at a variety of levels. We also need to engage actively in language. So more than just being a passive observer, learning one vocabulary word or one sign at one time, and then moving on, play with it, use it, put it in context. All of these kinds of things will increase our language availability, thus decreasing our effort in that range. So this was Daniel-Gile's efforts model, quick treatment of that, and Daniel-Gile's gravitational model of language availability we talked about with the target. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Have a great day.